Thank you so much for watching Landumc Goes There. Please subscribe and hit the like button and the bell notification button. Blowup is a 1966 mystery thriller directed by Michelangelo Antonioni, and it's produced by Carlo Ponti. This is the director's first entirely English language film, and it stars David Hemmings, Vanessa Redgrave, Sarah Miles, John Castle, Jane Birkin, Peter Boyles, as well as the famous 1960s model Veruska. When you watch the film nowadays, it takes a few minutes to acclimate yourself to the loopy psychedelic colors and the tendency of the hero to use words like fab, things that were common in the 60s. But after a short bit, you feel the spell of the movie settling around you. The director uses the materials of a suspense thriller without the payoff. He places them within a London of the heartless fashion photography, groupies, bored rock audiences, and pot parties, and a hero whose dead soul is briefly aroused by a challenge to his craftsmanship. The movie stars David Hemmings, who became a 1960s icon after his performance as Thomas in this film. He plays a hot young photographer with a Beatles haircut and a Rolls convertible that he drives around in. He's got girls hanging all over him, wanting to pose for him or to put out for him. The depths of his spiritual hunger are evident and are suggested in 3 brief scenes involving his neighbor, played by Sarah Miles, who lives with the painter across the way from him. He looks at her as if she alone could heal his soul, and she may have done this at one time, but she's not available. He spends his days in tightly scheduled photo shoots, and his nights are spent visiting flop houses to take pictures that might provide a nice contrast in his book of fashion photography. Thomas ends up wandering into a park and sees at a distance a man and a woman. Are they struggling? Are they playing? Are they flirting? He snaps a lot of photographs of them, and the woman, played by Vanessa Redgrave, runs after him. She desperately wants the film that he just took back, but he refuses to give it to her. She later tracks him down in his studio, takes off her shirt, and wants to seduce him and steal the film back. He does a little switching of the film canisters and sends her away with the wrong roll of film. He then blows up his photos, and in this film's brilliantly edited centerpiece, he discovers that he may have photographed a murder. The director cuts back and forth between the photos and the photographer, using closer shots and larger blow-ups, until we see arrangements of light and shadow, dots and blurs, that may show, well, we're not really sure. He's briefly interrupted by 2 girls who have been pestering him all day, and he engages in wild sex play as they roll around in a crumpled up backdrop paper. After he sends them away, his eyes turn quickly to the blow-ups. He makes more prints, and in the grainy, almost abstract blow-ups, it appears that the woman is looking towards some bushes. There is a gunman there, and perhaps in one photo, we see a man lying on the ground. Perhaps not. Thomas decides to return to the park, and he does actually see the man lying dead on the ground. What is really unclear with the film is whether or not he witnessed a murder. The audience understandably shares his interpretation of the photos, but another scenario is completely plausible. Redgrave wanted the photos because she was having an adulterous affair and her gray-headed lover dropped dead, and she simply fled the park in panic, and his body by the next morning had simply been discovered and removed. Whether there is a murder or not isn't the point. The film is about a character who's mired in distaste and who is roused by his photographs into something approaching passion. As Thomas moves between the darkroom and the blow-ups, we recognize the bliss that he enjoys in what artists often call the process. He's not thinking about money, ambition, or his own nasty personality defects, but he's lost in his craft. His mind, hands, and imagination work in a rhythmic sync. He's entirely happy at that point. In the famous final sequence, back in the park, Thomas encounters university students who are in the film's very first scene. These white-faced clowns are participating in a ritual known as rag, in which students dress up and roar around town raising money for charity. They end up playing tennis with an imaginary ball, and the photographer pretends that he can see the ball. We hear the sound of the tennis on the soundtrack. Then the photographer wanders away across the grass, and from one frame to the next, he disappears, like the corpse. The film contains a really rare performance by the Yardbirds during the period when Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck were both in the band. Jeff Beck would leave the group just a few months later. Among the homeless men that you see in the photographs that are taken by the photographer, you see Julio Cortázar, who wrote the original short story which the movie is based. Sean Connery turned down the lead role because he just couldn't understand what the director was talking about in the film. And it really is a hard one to understand until you watch it, and maybe even watch it a second time. Then it all seems to click together, and it's excellently done. When the lead character in the film, played by David Hemmings, auditioned for the role, and during the actual filming of the movie, he was somewhat annoyed to see the director was shaking his head back and forth, and he interpreted that gesture as being a negative in the fact that he thought that the director didn't like what he was doing. But he soon realized that this gesture was simply a tic, and it had no negative meaning to it at all. Once this mystery was solved, he was prepared to love the work that this director did, and he never ended up telling the director about the week of hell that he put him through when he first didn't know about this affliction that he had. Antonioni felt that this film marked a radical departure from his previous films. He tried in those films to probe the relationships between one person and another. Most often, they were love relationships and the fragility of their feelings. But in this film, none of those themes mattered at all. Here it's the relationship between an individual and reality, those things that are all around him. The experience of the protagonist is not a sentimental nor an amorous one, but rather one regarding his relationship with the world. The director offered little in the way of insight into his intentions for the film, and he was always clear that the meaning wasn't meant to be spelled out. Vanessa Redgrave had to work double duty while she was filming her role in the film. She would shoot this film during the day, while at the same time starring every night, plus 2 matinees a week, in the title role of the prime of Miss Jean Brodie on stage. Despite this terribly rough schedule, she loved working with this famed director and found it very rewarding. This movie really pushed the boundaries on what a film could show in theaters, especially with American audiences. MGM got a little creative, and they bypassed the production code, also known as the censors, by creating a company called Premier Productions. This was basically a dummy company that had no agreement or affiliation with the production code, and therefore they didn't have to adhere to the same standards as most films did. This allowed MGM to not have to cut the full frontal nudity and other sexually explicit scenes, plus they also maintained all the rights to the film. When this movie opened to rave reviews and an excellent box office, this really was what was considered to be the final blow in the production code's credibility, and it was replaced with the rating system less than 2 years later. Now, this film is not for everybody. You really have to think your way through it and understand the time period that it was done in. I think it's a great movie, looking back on it and watching it for a second time. Take a look at it and see if you enjoy it as I did. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.